Good afternoon, and thank you for coming and joining us on our last lecture of the season. Jim Snyder has been a lifelong journalist since graduating from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism in 1958. After 40 years as a Washington news correspondent and magazine publisher, he moved to South Florida and has since authored several books on its rich local history. Jim lives on the Caloosahatchee River and is active in promoting and preserving the history and designation as the first federally designated wild and scenic river. Jim's latest book, a second historical novel, is entitled The Cross and the Mask. It arrives just as South Florida celebrates the discovery of Florida by Juan Ponce de Leon 500 years ago this month. Here he is to tell us more about the cross and the mask. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Snyder.
Thanks, Tony. First thing people always ask is, why did you write the book and what did you want to accomplish? And the second part of that is very easy. I just want to make people more aware of those who lived here before we did. And I don't think enough people are aware of the Indians and especially their encounters with the Spanish. The first part of that equation is, why did you write the book? Well, I have writer's disease. It's kind of the same thing as, why do people suddenly decide they want to play the violin? Or why do they want to paint in oils? Or they can't explain it. And I think that people who have writer's disease, some of them go into journalism, those with curiosity, and then once they let their curiosity go to work, they also get competitive because there's a lot of other aggressive, curious people out there too. So the most exciting thing you can do is a story that nobody's done before. And really, I don't think anybody has done the one in this book. Think, for example, Watergate. That would have been the holy grail to Woodward and Bernstein. Or think about how thrilled the first reporter was who stumbled onto Monica Lewinsky. It's the same kind of thrill. My first holy grail was a book called The Faith and the Power, which I wrote. It covers the years after the crucifixion of Jesus to the destruction of the Jewish temple in AD 70. I did it because I found the book of Acts was rather murky when it came to chronology, and so I spent a lot of years digging into the chronology and came up with a book that told the story of the first Christians in a multi-dimensional way, in that it brought in the Romans and the Greeks and the Jews as well. Then I moved to South Florida, and I found holy grails everywhere, really. Trapper Nelson over at Jonathan Dickinson State Park, the Lighthouse, the history of Jupiter de Cuesta. I did one for this historical society called Black, Gold, and Silver Sands, which was the history of agriculture in Palm Beach County. Maybe some of you know that. And I did another one called A Light in the Wilderness, which was the founding of South Florida. And all of those really, I didn't do because something spoke to me. I did them because nobody had done them before, and it was a wonderful challenge. Along the way, I became a member of the Florida Historical Commission, which is a state body in charge of passing on the validity of historic sites and getting grant money for them and so forth. And a couple of years ago, they were then talking about and planning for the Viva 500 Florida, which would be the celebration of Ponce de Leon. So I looked into Ponce de Leon. Where did he first land? The answer is he landed everywhere, probably. And the reason for that is that the people on board ship had to go frequently to get fresh meat, and they had to get water, and they were actually under a mandate from a very sophisticated cartography group that the king maintained back in Seville. And they wanted to map all these inlets that they could. So, especially because they thought there may be a passage across Florida that would help protect their ships that were getting pummeled by storms and whatnot, going from Mexico all the way back to Spain in the fall. The problem with Ponce de Leon is that he got shot at everywhere he went. Arrows were flying. He hardly ever got off the boat to go and look for water and meat. After a few years, he came back to the Tampa Bay area and with 500 men. They were intending to settle, and they hardly ever got off the boat, even in that case, because the Indians came out in catamarans and shot him full of arrows, and Ponce de Leon took one in the shoulder. He had to retreat back to Havana, and he eventually died there. So, in terms of a journalist trying to put a book together, frankly, it's only a 50-page book. So, this is not about Ponce de Leon. 50 years passed. There was really little more Spanish action. There was some sporadic. For example, the Dominican friar Luis Cancer in 1549 sold the king on the idea that the problem with all these other landings was soldiers. They were menacing looking, they were armed, and they frightened the otherwise peaceful Indians. So he got a couple of ships and they let him off on the beach, again near Tampa, and he knelt on the beach with his cross to show the Indians who might be lurking in the background his peaceful intent. And immediately he got about 5 arrows through his chest, and they rushed out and they beat him to death with conch clubs. So again, more time passed. And I began to wonder, who were these Indians with such strong convictions? That's what really consumed me with a lot of research. So I'd like to set the historical stage for you, if I might, as to these Indians and their background. You know, the Sumerians were a civilization for 7,000 years. The Egyptians for probably 6,000 years. Stonehenge in southern England probably had something going 4,000 years ago. Rome was only a nation for 3,000 years, would be generous. Spain, 2,500 years, and it wasn't even Spain. It was a little kingdom of Castile and Aragon. Didn't even use the name Spain. So, how about the United States? It would be 400 years if you counted the very first date from Plymouth Rock, and it'd be 238 years if you counted from 1775, the Declaration of Independence. So, the Indians here had been here for 10 to 12,000 years. That's a long time. The Calusa Indians, who were the ones who did the most of the shooting at Ponce de Leon, had been a kingdom, a cohesive political unit that archaeologists can verify for at least 2,000 years. Now that's 1,000 years longer than Spain, and that's 10 times longer than the United States has been a nation. So it's no wonder that they had some strong convictions and a fairly fierce attitude when it came to strangers coming into their land. Now you're up to 1547, okay? That's when this book starts. And I want to read you a few words to set the stage there, if I may. This is the first words in the book. In the year 1547, Ivan IV crowned himself the first Tsar of Moscow and would soon be known as Ivan the Terrible. In France, another new monarch, Henry II, set out to conquer every Italian city-state in his warpath. In England, 9-year-old Edward VI succeeded Henry VIII and was soon betrothed to Mary, Queen of Scots. She was 5 years old. Nearly everything else from the Netherlands south through the Iberian Peninsula paid allegiance to Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But keeping the bulky confederation intact meant maintaining a military colossus to confront the spread of Protestant heresy in Northern Europe and of Islam on his southern shores. Across the Great Sea, there lived another king and his royal entourage. His name was Calus, and at age 19, he was taller and more powerfully built than any European monarch. His people had existed as a cohesive political unit for twice as long as the still developing kingdom of Aragon and Castile, which some had begun to call Spain. So that's the setting. What was the Calusa domain? I hope you all took these maps that I passed out. They had the cover of the book, an inside's cover. You might take a look at that if you haven't already. And maybe if you don't have any, somebody could pass them on to you. The Calusa are in a little bit bigger type font than the rest of the Indians because they were by far the leading tribe. They ruled with a very strong arm, and they did it from Tampa Bay, which was known as Tocobaga. That was the tribe that occupied that, all the way down to Matecumbe Key, and probably a little bit south of that in the Florida Keys. Their seats of the most population were on Marco Island, and they were on Pine Island. If you've ever been to the Randall Research Center on Pine Island out in the west, that's the Chief Calusa Research Center right now. But at this time, the King Calus and his royal entourage were headquartered on Mountain Key. And if you'll see that over there, I think it says Fort San Antonio. That's later where the Spanish built a fort. And Mountain Key today is a very little known state park. I have kayaked out there a couple times. It probably is only 2 miles around. It has what's left of a Grand Canal in the middle, and on both sides are mounds that are probably 40 to 50 feet high. And those mounds, unlike all the mangrove islands around them, were created over centuries by the Calusa. And it took them as long to do as it took to build the Cathedral of Salisbury or Valencia, you know, that kind of thing. They did it by putting shells and then heaping sand over them for years and years and years. So that was on Mountain Key. And all these other tribes that you see scattered around your map there, the A's up on Hutchinson Island, that area, the Yega and Jupiter, the Tequesta, which were at the mouth of the Miami River in today's Miami. And by the way, if you know about Tequesta, Florida, that's simply the invention of a developer who thought his little town was actually a housing development. The name of Tequesta would be clever and attractive marketing-wise. But the Tequesta were in the Miami of old. It's interesting that even the Lucayan Indians of Grand Bahama Island paid homage to this king. Now, you didn't think about that. They had to come over here in catamaran canoes for 50 miles to pay him tribute. So he must have really been worthy of a lot of respect. What about Palm Beach? That's a mystery. You could say they were South Yega land or they were North Tequesta land. And I think one of the reasons why there's no focal point was that these Indian cultures got their names because they were clustered around an inlet. And I think Lake Worth at the time was probably closed. It was probably all fresh water. There was no Palm Beach Inlet then. Who were the Calusa as a people? If you were an anthropologist or an archaeologist, you'd say, well, they existed on shelves. They were could have been nomads, although they did have permanent headquarters. They existed on fish and seafood of all kinds. In July, they used to go up in the rivers of the West Coast and hunt the great sturgeon, which still jump around out there at this time in the summertime. They were very tall, they were muscular, and they had a caste system. The people on Mount Key, the royal entourage, did not eat the same foods as the Indians and the vassal tribes, and others were forbidden from eating the same foods as they did. I'm not saying there wasn't any overlap, but basically they had their own way of life, they intermarried, and they certainly lorded it over all the other tribes. Think about this. According to the Spanish journals of the Spaniards who had been there, the king's house could accommodate 2,000 people. At one ceremony that they gave for the Spanish, I'm getting ahead on this, the Spanish wrote that he had 500 singers, the king had 500 singers entertaining him. I tend to not believe all of that, but let's say it was 1,000. Let's say it was 250 singers. That took a lot of organization. They all didn't live on Mount Key. They had to go there had to be runners or couriers telling them what to do. They had to meet somewhere. They had to practice. And I think it takes a lot of organization. Just think if Palm Beach Convention Center had a meal for 2,000 to prepare. You know, that would take a lot of organization, ordering, food buying, and all that kind of thing. So they were people to be reckoned with. Now, why would they have vassal tribes? I'm going to give you the Yega of Jupiter Inlet as an example. Well, in the case of the Yega, their job in terms of paying tribute to the king and supporting him was to watch for Spanish ships that were coming up and down the Gulf Stream, coming from Mexico, laden with gold and silver on their way to and from Spain. And the weather was so precarious, and these boats were no more than 100 feet long, sometimes 200 if they were a giant galleon, and they would crack up all the time, be buffeted about like corks by hurricanes and things, and a sufficient number of them would crack up on the coast of Jupiter. And so it was the mandated task of the Jaeger to bring all the gold they could from these wrecks back to Mount Key. And the king was rumored by the Spanish to have hundreds of thousands of ducats worth of gold in storage. The second reason for being there was to capture as many shipwrecked sailors as they could and take them back as slaves to Calus. At one time, the Spanish documented that he had 40 Spanish slaves living there from various hurricane wrecks and all that. And at the time the Spanish finally managed to go there, he had only 9 left. And the rest had all been sacrificed in during conclaves and as part of religious rites. So as proof of how this system was policed, there was a time when somebody snitched on the Jaeger that they had withheld some gold that their chief had. And within a few days, the Calusa king sent some armed warriors up there, and they chopped off the head of the king and his chief shaman and his chief general. And they seemed to like chopping heads because the Spanish like to do it as well, by the way. And I give you proof that mankind keeps evolving for the better, because the Spanish were able to do it with battle axes, which were a lot sharper, you know, and more efficient. But eventually that became somewhat difficult, because the people using the axes on the condemned would say, you know, I don't do this every day, and this blade may be very dull, and if your family could come up with a couple $100, then I can go sharpen it, you know. And they'd say, $200? What are you talking about? And he'd say, well, okay, it may take me 3 or 4 whacks, you know, with this dull blade. And so he'd get the money. Well, because of that, I'm compressing history a lot, the French evolved an even more mercenary and high-tech operation that was called a guillotine. And it was, as I say, much more efficient. And then further proof that man is evolving is that the Americans came along with even better high-tech, and they invented something in Florida we call Old Sparky. And frankly, you know, you all know what Old Sparky is. The electric chair, of course. But I would rather take my chances on the guillotine. Anyway, I have digressed. Another reason for the Calusa policing the Jaeger, or making them vassals, is, unbeknownst to most of us, right whales came down from Nova Scotia every January or February, and they went in the inlets. They enjoyed the warm weather, and they would mate, and they would also deliver calves, and they would hang outside of inlets like Jupiter, and sometimes they would come in to bear their calves. And the Indians would go out in catamaran canoes and surround an Indian or a whale in the ocean, and they would, one of their members who had been designated as extra brave would jump on this 30 to 40 foot whale and ride him like a bull, and spear his harpoon into the whales, 2 harpoons for 2 blowholes that the whales had. And the whale would start struggling and bucking like a bull until its lungs exploded, and the Indians would lasso its tail, and they would bring it in to shore where the women would be there to cut it all up. And out of that, they used the blubber for a lot of things, but they used it for paint, grease paint and whatnot for their faces. And the meat they would dry, and sometimes make meal out of it, but they would dry it into steaks, and they always had to make sure that King Calus got his share of it. So, how did the Calusa get around to do their enforcing or policing of the vassal tribes? And that's, again, is geography. I want you to think about something. Think about 16th century Florida. No dikes around Lake Okeechobee. The Miami River ran all the way from Lake Okeechobee all the way down to Tequesta land. That was an easy reach. But how are you going to get over to the Jaeger? If you're a Calusa and you're living on Mount Key, what you're going to do is go up the Caloosahatchee River where Punta Gorda is, or Charlotte, Port Charlotte, and you're going to go up the Caloosahatchee River. There's a few waterways like Apache and whatnot that connect to Lake Okeechobee, which was called Lake Miami then, sorry to say. And they would go around the rim canal. There was a canal of sorts, and then they would encounter their first difficult spot on the eastern end of Lake Okeechobee, which was surrounded by custard apple orchards. And you couldn't call them orchards, really. They were gnarly, very sharp-branched, small trees that made a thicket that was very difficult to penetrate. And what the Indians had done was to dig a whole series of canals. And these canals probably reached 30 or 40 miles until they reached the headwaters of the Caloosahatchee River and the St. Lucie River. And from there on, it was a very easy trip by canoe. It was 130 miles, and I'm guessing they could probably do it in 3 long days, especially if you're the king and you're riding in a catamaran canoe on a raised dais, a raised chair, and you have 4 rowers rowing. You just sit and take it easier. What? Who's tired? I'm not tired, you know. So, let's turn to the Spanish. Why would the Spanish try again? I'm going to have a little drink here. The Spanish had come to Mexico in 1519 or thereabouts. They had been there for several years. The mines were already beginning to wear out, and the slaves who worked the mines were really wearing out because thousands of them had died at Spanish hands in these mines. They had also died to European disease, which is a big factor in this book that I wrote. The king, King Philip II, ruled at this time, and all of this gold and coming from the New World had turned him into a junkie. It's like if you were going along on a budget of $100,000 and all of a sudden you had a budget of $150,000, which is about what this gold added to his kingdom. It allowed him to think on a grander scale, to pursue more wars. And once he got used to that, he needed it desperately to maintain the apparatus that he had created. So he needed this money for wars against the Moors on his southern coast, the Muslims. And then there was the dreaded Lutherans, the Huguenot Lutherans in Flanders and up around Spain, France, who were creating all sorts of troubles for Roman Catholicism. And make matters worse, the king was always in hock to the bankers of Seville and Cadiz. They are in the southern part of Spain. It was the richest part of Spain, and they had a hammerlock on the trade that went back and forth in gold and silver. You know, the king could order them beheaded, he could cite them for treason, he could do anything like that, but the king was like the rest of us, and he had a bank account. And if the bank account was dry, he could say, I want 500 men dispatched to Florida or wherever, and the bankers would say, your account, Your Majesty, is overdrawn. We can't do that. And he'd have to grumble and curse and everything, but he'd have to get along with it. Now, the reason I'm explaining all that is there was an institution in Spain known as the adelantamiento. And what that really meant was you could find yourself, if you were the king, you could find a buccaneer who was a respectable buccaneer, and he might finance an expedition somewhere. And the bottom line would be that the king would get 25% of everything he got. And you usually signed up such a person to a 3-year contract. Now, King Philip found himself a perfect match with a man named Pedro Menendez de Aviles. And Pedro Menendez was if a computer had spit out his name, you know, in a contest to be the best adelantado, he would have won. He was good looking. He was an experienced Armada captain. He had been to Mexico several times. He was very ambitious. He knew the Atlantic. He had been actually the king's personal captain on a couple of major trips. Why would this guy Menendez be interested in doing that? Well, for one thing, He was from Asturia, which is, if you know where Balboa is on the coast, it's up on the northern coast right near the Pyramids. It's more windy and cold and rugged up there. The people tended to be poorer than the people who lived in lush Andalusia down south, and they tended to be those who sent carpenters and sailors and soldiers into the king's fleet. But there were bankers there, and they were very jealous of the banks of Seville, and they were determined to break the hammerlock that they had on the financing. And Florida proved to be, the prospect of Florida proved to be the vehicle that caused them to want to invest. Now, beside that, an adelantado like Menendez could get great rewards in terms of land grants. I mean, it was nothing to give a land grant the size of Connecticut to a person like this. He could also become a viceroy if things really worked out. And he always had the example of Cortez in Mexico to go by. Cortez is the man who subdued Montezuma, and who started all the mines there, and who eventually became a viceroy, and he became so wealthy that the king let it be known to him that he was just too rich, that he was actually a threat to the king. And it would be really nice if he would retire to his estates in Andalusia and enjoy the rest of his life. And if he didn't, he might be risking the charge of treason. So Menendez wasn't worried about treason, he was just worried about getting rich enough, so he had to worry about it. So he had to persuade the king, though, that he was the man to go to Florida. For one thing, I told you about the riches that the king could get. They could grow crops for the tables of Florida, or tables of Europe. They could grow cattle. It was limited in hilly Spain to grow cattle. They could raise cattle. And there was something coming along in Cuba called sugar that really intrigued them. They just had the first sugar mills operating down there, and it showed great promise. There was also the matter of finding a passage across the state of Florida, this vast land of Florida, which, by the way, everything from Key West all the way up to Newfoundland was called Florida in those days. But they were talking chiefly about the little peninsula that we now live on. They thought if they could find somehow a passage between the east and the west coast that would enable them to have calmer waters during all these periods of storm, and it would just be a faster trip. It took about 30 days to get across the Atlantic as it was. They also had the opportunity, they thought, maybe to free captives that were taken by the Calusa. Menendez's own son, Juan, was one of the captains of the Armada, and he had been lost somewhere near Cape Canaveral. And at this time, he had only been lost for less than a year. So there was a great urge on the part of his father to rescue him. Then there was the matter of converting the Indians to Catholicism. You know, the Pope had granted Spain all over the Western Hemisphere, and it was with a specific condition that they convert as many Indians as they could to Roman Catholicism. They would become happy farmers, and they would be Christians and gladly work for the Spanish. And then, just as a bonus, there was the idea of the Fountain of Youth. We all kind of snicker at it now, having realized that so far we haven't found it, have we? But they continued to believe in that enough that it was always intriguing. It was always a carrot out there waiting for them. But, as I said before, the king had been burned before. There were failures. And then the record of Menendez himself presented, that's just a little bit of a problem. He had been jailed already once for being caught by the authorities and the port authorities in Seville he was caught sneaking out 10 cartons with horses pulling wagons, I'm trying to say, of silver when he had come back from Mexico. In other words, the king's official booty got taken off the boat, and then in the dead of night, around just before dawn, all these horses lined up, and they took 10 wagons full of silver to a friend of Menendez. And Menendez said, I don't know anything about that, you know, but they put him in jail, and he stayed for a few months. And he was also frowned upon by the official bankers and port authorities of Seville for having done the following. Once his ships, his caravan, had gone down the river, Guadalcanal River, that goes to Seville, They would stop just before they got to the open sea, and there they were observed by spies from the port authorities loading up extra passengers for Menendez's own account. You know, he was each paying him whatever, $500 for passage to Florida, and he was collecting it and putting it in his own pocket. So he was a buccaneer, but he was the probably still the best candidate. Now, I want to tell you that the trump card that he played. The trump card with the king was that Menendez said, you know, there's really some strong rumors out there that the French are building a fort over in Florida, up around what is now Jacksonville. And not only that, but the guy doing this is Jean Ribault, who was known far and wide as the chief buccaneer of the French. In fact, he looked just like Menendez. He was the same age. They could have been brothers. And the king went bananas. He said, Madre de Dios, we don't want any Huguenot Lutherans preaching to the Indians. Oh my goodness. So he commissioned Menendez to set sail for Florida. And he sent several soldiers with him, and off they went. And now I'm going to try to describe a little bit about this book that I wrote. It is fiction, because you have to fill out certain blanks on computers with people like Amazon and whatnot to describe yourself. But I want to stress to you that the chronology of this book is accurate. The events are real. The Spanish people are real, as described in their own journals, and their own journals were voluminous and very meticulous. Sometimes they varied as to the story depending on who's telling it, but by and large, they were wonderful record keepers. The Indian people in this book are real, as described by the Spaniards. But we don't know the Indian perspective unless somebody comes along and tries to furnish that. They left no records behind. We don't know their perspective, and that's the role that I tried to play with this book. You can rely a great deal on archaeology. You can look at their masks that they did, which are preserved in water and muck, and you can learn a lot about their art and what they ate and where they lived and so forth. And the trick is to develop characters around that are believable, which I hope I have. This book starts, well, I should say the book alternates chapter-wise for most of the book between what the Spanish were doing, what the Indians were doing, Spanish, Indians, and eventually they converge into some interesting developments. The Indian perspective is best told by a boy who starts out as a baby named Little Heron, and he lives in Jaggedtown in Jupiter, which is along Du Bois Park, if you know where Du Bois Park is, if you have been up there. It used to have Indian mounds going for practically 1,000 feet, and right now it's reduced to maybe 100 feet around the Du Bois house. They were all ancient Indian mounds, and I have he and his mother living on top of one of those mounds in Yega village. And he happens to be the son of Calus the king. Now, he's I shouldn't say illegitimate son, but he's not the son that Calus wants to raise back on Mount Key, because what would happen is the Calusa would have annual conclaves, sometimes not annual, but conclaves in which all the tribes would gather, the nobles of all the tribes. And they would arrange marriages just the way they did in 16th century Europe. They would trade, and as I said, they would sacrifice captives they'd been saving up for the occasion. And the king would also marry various women from the tribes to show his solidarity with the tribe, that he was at one with them. But once that was over and the king had a jolly good time for a couple nights, he would go back to Mount Key and the woman would raise her child alone. And that's what happened in this case. So Little Heron is a boy who's constantly being promoted by his mother as the son of a king, but he is being denied by the Calusa over on Mount Key. And as a result, lives a life in which he doesn't really know his identity until later in the book. Now, I want to just read you to get you in the mood of 16th century Florida. Maybe you can recognize this perhaps when you were a child somewhere, if it was in Florida. This takes place along the old inlet in Jupiter. Now, you know in Jupiter, as your map shows, it's not the current inlet that was made in 1921. South of that by a quarter of a mile, there was another inlet that went to the sea. And if you go to Du Bois Park, if you can picture a bridge that goes over an opening that leads out into the Caloosahatchee, where a lot of mothers today take their little children because they can go swim and wade along there. That's the old opening that the Spanish ships came through. He's 12 years old. Little Heron's favorite time was early morning. While his mother was still sleeping, he would creep away from the hut with only his deer cloth, sandals, and spear. He loved the rippling current of the outgoing tide where the river swung into the Yega Inlet on its last push to the sea. Just beyond the ripples, the water flattened out to a glass-like surface. The rays of the rising sun beamed between the gnarled branches of the live oaks behind the ocean dunes. They streaked the still water in painted colors on the dozens of so canoes that were pulled up on the sand. Soon the air would be alive with the cries of babies and voices of mothers as they cleaned pots, washed clothes, and traded gossip. But for now, the sunlit water magnified the wonders below. Snails digging, minnows darting, and shells glittering. Little Heron walked on to where the sandy beach gave way to mangroves. He waded knee-deep, sometimes to the waist, for several minutes, till he reached a bend in the inlet and began to hear the sound of waves breaking at the mouth, still a half-mile away. There he stood beside a large enclosure that had been created by cutting down spindly pines, breaking the trunks into 4-foot lengths, and pounding them side by side into the shallow water until they comprised a stockade prison for captured fish. The intensity of life all around him, sand crabs burrowing and ibises jabbing at the sand, minnows darting around his ankles, a blue heron standing on one leg studying the water intently, a pelican gliding inches over the water, a tarpon fin turning lazily on the surface, a ray lifting itself out of the water, an osprey diving into the water and emerging with a mullet in its talons. Now he watched mullet jumping, 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Was it trying to fly? Was something chasing it? Or do mullets, he wondered, simply enjoy leaping the way boys do, just to see how far they can jump? And if somebody knows why mullets jump today, tell me, please, because I don't. This tranquility that I mentioned would soon be broken. Menendez came to St. Augustine in 1565, and like the school books say, he did kneel with a cross. He had an altar that was taken from the ship and placed on the sand. There was a priest in front of him who sang a psalm, and they prayed together. Afterwards, they had a Thanksgiving with the curious and friendly Indians who were not above getting a free meal. After that, they laid out the town, and they created a judicial system, and they named a governor for the fort that they were going to build. But what the textbooks don't really say enough of is that right before that, Menendez had landed a little bit further up near Jacksonville, and they went around the back in a very rainy, muddy morning before dawn, and they took this Fort Caroline from the back end, the only part that wasn't protected. They just stormed into that fort, and when it was over in about an hour, they had killed a couple of hundred Frenchmen. And then, once this little ceremony of Thanksgiving was over with, they took off down the coast again. And the reason for that is when they attacked the fort, they didn't realize that the French were still unloading supply vessels that had come in, and there was another 150 men or so who were out on the vessel, and when they saw what was happening, they took off. They happened to hit a big storm, and their ships were pretty much shattered, and the Indians reported that these men were now walking along Menendez Inlet in that area, I don't know how many miles, 50 miles south of there. So Menendez took off with a group of about 150 men to capture them. And He found Jean Ribault some days later with his men, and they tried to negotiate for their lives. And they offered 100,000 ducats if they could be spared, or maybe given a ship to go back to France in, because they said France and Spain are really not technically at war. We're just rivals. And Menendez said all along, no, you must trust to my mercy. So the next day, Jean Ribault and his officers and several dozen men came over, and they surrendered all their arms and their standards. And they were each given a Spanish interview, an inquisition, as to their beliefs, and if they were found to really be French Huguenots, then they were to be taken behind the dunes and have their heads lopped off with battle axes, which they did. And but the night before, there were a lot of the men, about 75 of them, who did not trust the Adelantano's word, and they took off down the beach, willing to trust their fates to the sea and to the Indians. So Menendez and his men further took off after them. They captured them, to make a long story short, and at this time they were in the territory of the A's Indians, AIS, and they are at this point near Cape Canaveral. And they sent a boat to Cuba where they had kept their warehouses, hoping they could get resupplied. And meanwhile, they found the A's friendly, and they built a settlement maybe 9 miles from the main A's village. And there they hoped to live in peace until the ship from Spain could come back and resupply them. Well, the fact is that the ship didn't show up, and they wound up eating the A's out of house and home. And finally the A's rose up, and there were women issues too. You know, women are always creating problems, you know that. And anyway, pretty soon it was a matter of, now they had the French captives. They hadn't killed them because Menendez felt some remorse. He figured he was going to get in trouble with the king for doing that. So now they have 150 men, 75 French captives, and they are marching down the beach. And they got the A's in hot pursuit. And they land on what is St. Lucie Inlet. All these men are clustered there. And they know the A's are going to catch up to them any time, and the inlet is too deep and the current is too strong to get across. What are they going to do? They're probably going to be slaughtered. Just then, they spot the French or the Spanish supply ship that had never been able to locate them. And the guy pulled up within shouting distance, and they explained their plight, and he said, I'm going to go try to find an inlet south of here in another territory other than the A's, and see if I can ferry all you guys over here before the A's come and catch you. So he did, and he sailed down. This was a supply ship with only 6 men in it. And he sails down, and it's now late morning, let's say. He sails 15 miles down. It's now mid-afternoon, 15 miles. He sees no inlet, no opening. And he's getting really nervous. And just then, they do a makeshift crow's nest, and one of his men climbs up here, and they look over this sandbar, and they can see a village with canoes pulled up, and they see what could be an Indian great house, which is on the mound where the lighthouse is. And he says, all right, we're going to try one, there's got to be an inlet here somewhere. We're going to try one more hour or so. So he goes 1 more mile, and then he sees a blue inlet floating out into sea. He sees porpoises swimming by. He glides his ship in this inlet, and he's still in the middle of the inlet, which is the old Jupiter Inlet. And he's got his men all ready with their arquebuses, their long rifles, ready to shoot if they have to. He looks up in the trees, and he anchors out in the middle, and he sees all sorts of eyes looking at him, you know, and he knows these are warriors ready to be unleashed on him. But just as they're about ready to pull up anchor and leave, he also sees little children playing naked in the water on the beach, and he reasons that the Indians aren't going to kill their own kids in the middle of a melee. So just then they see a canoe with 3 Indians coming in, and it's 2 elderly Indians and 1 muscular young man. That's little Heron. And the canoe comes and circles around this boat, and they say, Yega, Yega? And the Yega go, yeah, Yega. And he said, oh, thank God, it's not the A's anymore. Maybe we have a chance with these fellows. And he says, speak Spanish? And much to his surprise, the youth in the back, little Heron, says, un poco, solamente, speak slowly. And I will read you the rest, which is my last little reading. Who is your cacique? He asked the lad. Little Heron pointed to Deerstalker, the man in front of him. Please ask the cacique, will he allow my men to stay here in this inlet until I can go to Cuba and bring them food in another ship? The youth consulted again with the elders. How many days here, Yucatan? He asked. 14, guessed Amaya. Amaya is the captain of the supply ship. He could see this produced confusion, so he sent a sailor to his cabin to fetch a paper and quill. He drew a sun with rays and a crescent moon and put a circle around them. He stroked 14 short lines on the paper and handed it down for the youth and his cacique to peruse. Ah, noted the cacique without waiting for an interpreter. When I come back, I will give you many things from Cuba, Amaya quickly added. But for now, he realized he had none of the usual beads, tools, and trinkets that seemed to entice Indians, so he began improvising. We will bring you good tobacco. He motioned to a sailor who reluctantly produced a pouch from his pocket. Throw it to him, he said. We bring you many other things, he said again. With a flourish, he undid a silver-buckled leather belt holding his waistcoat up and handed it down to the chief. We will give you fine cooking pots, he said, jerking his head toward the astonished cook, who darted inside to find one. And fine metal knives like this, he said, slipping a scabbard from a startled sailor's waistband and handing it down to the young interpreter. Where am I? Excuse me. Finally, Amaya took off the broad straw hat that had been protecting him against the sun and sailed it down to another elder in the second canoe. We will bring those and many jewels besides. Then he asked the all-important question, will you trade us fish and fruits and venison for things like these? The men in the canoes conferred again. Yes, we will, said the interpreter. You may stay this many days, he said, pointing to the paper in his hand with the 14 scratches. Tomorrow we come back here, said Amaya, with a formal bow over the railing. They pulled up anchor and began rowing out, all with one eye on the arquebuses that stood loaded in the hatchway. With luck, they would return 16 miles northward with light to spare, and good knows that might help mend the tatters of Spanish expedition to the A's. Let us note that the day is December 13, 1565, said Amaya to the men around him after they had reached the Gulf Stream and relaxed in its surging power. It is the feast day of Santa Lucia, and we will build a fort at the inlet of the Yega. We will name it Santa Lucia, as our Adelantado would no doubt wish. And, well, it wouldn't be 2 weeks at all, because again, it was the old problem of supplying by ship. The ship didn't come. Menendez had no money. Menendez, by this time, was back in Cuba. He had no money. The governor of Cuba hated him because he viewed this upstart from the king as invading his own territory. And the ships could scarcely find the inlets they were supposed to find in Florida. So it went from peace to trading to a détente to hunger to starvation to a very major conflagration between the Yega and the Spanish. What started out as 236 Spanish and French occupants of this Fort Santa Lucia. And it led to one of history's most dramatic clashes of culture, and it's symbolized by the title that the Christian cross and the mask of the fearsome Indian gods. And it would only intensified once Menendez returned and went around to Mound Key, because the objective of the Spanish was to form 6 settlements all around the southern half of Florida, ranging from St. Augustine all the way around to Mound Key. And that they did. Through all this, the boy, little Heron, would become an adult and become named Lujo, or Lujo in Spanish. He becomes an interpreter, then he becomes converted, and then he becomes a very central figure in this clash. And in the immortal words of Forrest Gump, that's all I'm going to say about that. I want to tell you that the Cross and the Mask is available for the first time this week. And it's really just in South Florida this spring. It will not be in bookstores everywhere until later in the fall. It takes a while to supply people like Barnes & Noble. But it certainly is in the store, the Classic Bookshop, run by Jeff Jacobus, who's sitting in the back. And I have one caveat that's going to put a damper on the discussion, perhaps. Now, I've given over 100 book talks, and I've never made a mistake as stupid as the one I have made today. Jeff didn't have any books in stock yet, so I went to my warehouse, and I got a couple cases for the car, and along with some other cases. So I put them in the car, and I took 2 cases and brought them to Jeff today. And lo and behold, one of the cases was the wrong book. So all I can tell you is we have 5 left, I think, here that haven't been sold already. And I will, if you will sign a pad there and tell me what you want on the book, you know, to Mary with best wishes or something, I will get these books to Jeff tomorrow, and they will go out tomorrow at my expense to your home, and you won't have to lug them home today. That's the only good news. But I apologize very much. The dumbest mistake I've ever made, probably. But that's it, and I will be signing books.